What's up guys, Eric from Rare Candy, and today we are coming at you with a new countdown video. It's been quite some time since we've done one, so I figured with the new Burning Shadows set it'd be a good time to revisit this idea. So we've gone over the entire Burning Shadows set in detail already with our set review, link in the description of course if you guys have not seen that. But today I'm going to be counting down our top 10 cards from the new Burning Shadows set. But before we get to the actual list, it's important to note we're only going to be listing new cards appearing in Burning Shadows that aren't already legal for play. So what that means is cards like the new Lovely Choice Band and Field Blower Secret Rare reprints, or the new full art versions of Tapu Bulu GX and Lycanroc GX will not be included on this list. So only new cards that are appearing in the set. So with that being said, let's get into the list and see what we are excited about. So before we hit the number 10 spot, it is worth mentioning we have a couple of honorable mentions that did not quite make our list. So me and Marcus both selected one card each that we felt kind of strongly about, but I don't think quite made the cut for our top 10. So the card Marcus is going to be submitting for us is going to be a trainer card called Wishful Baton. It's a Pokemon tool card, and it says if the Pokemon this card is attached to is your active Pokemon is knocked out by damage from an opponent's attack, move up to 3 basic energy cards from that Pokemon to one of your bench Pokemon. So, spoiler alert if you guys did not see our set review, we did mention this card has some synergy with Primal Groudon and could potentially be a really good inclusion in that deck, maybe for the Worlds format. And since this card only has such a limited use in that deck, since Primal Groudon has the Omega Barrier ability preventing Field Blower from getting rid of it, that kind of narrows its use to only being limited for this one deck in this one format. So I think Wishful Baton has a nice effect, but unfortunately most decks can just Field Blower it off if it's not on something like a Primal Groudon. And since it's only going to be decent for one tournament right now, didn't quite make the number 10 spot. And so the other card that narrowly missed our top 10 is going to be another trainer card. This one's going to be the new supporter Kiawe. So you get to search your deck for up to 4 fire energy and attach them to one of your Pokemon, shuffle your deck, and then your turn ends. So this is actually a decent effect, especially if you are going first and you can't attack anyways. You can sometimes play Kiawe and be able to, power up one of your Pokemon to get ready for the next turn. The reason this is not making our top 10 though, just because this is extremely situational. After the first turn, this card I don't think is as useful, just because you actually want to attack the following turns. You also might not always have access to it on the first turn, or even if you do, you still might need to do other things, maybe like play an actual supporter to get Pokemon you want to use Kiawe on. So I think it's a solid card that you're going to see pop up in decks, but I think it's just slightly too situational to crack our top 10. So those are going to be our 2 cards that barely made the list. So let's get on and see the ones that actually did. Coming in at the number 10 spot, we have Kingdra, a new Stage 2 Pokemon Burning Shadows is giving us. This is one I spoke of kind of highly in our set review. So Kingdra, 140 hit points. Has 2 attacks for just a single water energy each. Its first attack, Brine, does 90 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon that has any damage counters on it. And its second attack, Tornado Shot, for 1 water energy, does 90, and you discard a water energy from this Pokemon and does 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. So 1 energy attackers just in general are always pretty decent. That means they're easy to power up. Kingdra is a Stage 2 Pokemon, so that means it takes up a lot of deck space on its own, since you have to run, this huge evolution line and some rare candies to get your Kingdras out. But playing 1 energy is very nice because Tornado Shot, for just 1 energy with a Choice Band on your Kingdra, you're going to be doing 120 and then 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. Very, very solid attack. And then, of course, that will also set you up to cleanup knockouts with Kingdra's other attack, Brine, to snipe for 90 damage on one of your opponent's Pokemon as well. We've already done a little bit of testing with this archetype, or this card, and it seems to be a solid attacker. It can abuse Max Potion, only has 1 retreat, so you don't need to commit a lot of retreating cards in it. You can abuse things like Dive Ball for the Worlds format, of course. Also things like Brooklet Hill. And just in general, with all of the GXs running around, they're giving up 2 prizes. If you can manage to have a solid 1 prize attacker like Kingdra, you never know, Kingdra might be able to slide its way into the metagame at some point because of these things, and that's why it's going to be our number 10 spot. So coming in at the 9th spot on this list is yet another water Pokemon, and this time it's going to be the new Alolan Ninetales. And that's not the GX one we were talking about from Guardians Rising. This is actually a brand new non-GX version. So the reason this card is on our top 10 list is mainly for its ability Luminous Barrier. Prevent all effective attacks, including damage done to this Pokemon by your opponent's GX or EX Pokemon. So that's really good because the metagame at the time of filming, of course, is very dominated by Pokemon GX. You have things like Drampa GX, Decidueye GX, Metagross GX, the new Gardevoir GX looks to be very popular, etc., etc. So an extremely strong ability, and the attack is okay. I'll say it's okay. It's not great, but it is okay. But combined with the ability, I think Ninetales is something to consider. So its attack for a water and double colorless energy, it does 80, but of course if you have a choice band down on your Ninetales, you're going to be hitting for 110. So 110 is actually a pretty decent number. You're going to two-shot a lot of the different things that are currently in the format. 110 hit points is decent, 1 retreat cost is decent as well, but of course, like I said, the ability is really what we're taking a look at Ninetales for. But the reason it's on the lower end of this list is because right now at the time of filming, we still have access to things like Hex Maniac in the format, which can be easily searched out by Tapu Lele and be reused with Versus Seeker. But after rotation, Alolan Ninetales might warrant maybe a higher spot just because it is going to be harder to deal with this Luminous Barrier ability. Of course, we do still have some non-EX and GX Pokemon in the format. We still have Garbodor, which is very popular. We just mentioned that Kingdra at the number 10 spot. If that becomes ever a popular card, that could easily deal with Ninetales. But even still, I think this is definitely a card that is worth throwing 1 or 2 of in your existing Alolan Ninetales GX decks, just because sometimes you can kind of catch your opponent off guard and maybe shut them out of the entire game just thanks to this ability alone. If after rotation they aren't running something like a Garbodor or a Wobbuffet or something like that to deal with this ability. So next up we have Super Scoop Up coming in at the 8th spot. So even though we did mention that we aren't going to include reprints on this list like the ones we mentioned earlier, Super Scoop Up actually is currently not in the format at all. So even though it is a reprint, it is not currently legal, so that's why it did manage to secure a spot on this list. So Super Scoop Up has been a card that's been in the game for years now, and it's finally back, and the reason why this is going to be on this list is because you get to flip a coin. If heads, return one of your Pokemon and all cards attached to it to your hand. And over the years, this card has seen, success in a number of decks. Myself, I even, played this card heavily in Landorus Crobat when that was legal. But there's just in general a number of decks that abuse this card over the years, and has definitely proven itself to be a consistently solid card. So this is good because, well, you might be thinking, why do you want to return your Pokemon to your hand? You want to attack with them and, use their abilities. But Super Scoop Up is good because if your opponent has not knocked out one of your Pokemon but heavily damaged it, you can pick it up back to your hand to heal it and, start powering it back up. You can also do things like pick up your Shaman EXs or Tapu Lele GXs, or just any Pokemon that has an ability that gets activated whenever it comes into play. So it's just been a very good card over the years just to deny prizes and re-abuse coming into play abilities. So it's a pretty straightforward card, not too much to be said, but definitely has proven itself, and that's why it is on this list. Next up at number 7, we have our first GX of the list, and that's going to be the new Marshadow GX. So this is actually a pretty new Pokemon in the game as well. I think it is a legendary that's going to be distributed. So new card and a new Pokemon. But Marshadow, definitely a very interesting card. We had some polarizing opinions of this in our set review, but I think this card definitely has a lot of potential. So let's look at what it does. So Marshadow GX, 150 hit points on the lower side for a basic GX. Weakness to Psychic, also pretty bad because Espeon and Garbodor are both popular at the time of filming right now. Let's see, its attack Beatdown for 2 fighting and a colorless does 120, and then its GX attack Peerless 100 Blows GX. It does 50 times the amount of basic energy attached to this Pokemon. So you might look at this and say, well, why is this even on your top 10 list? This doesn't look very good. And that's going to be for its ability Shadow Hunt. This Pokemon can use the attacks of any basic Pokemon in your discard pile, but you still need the correct energy to use those attacks. So this is why Marshadow has made itself on this list, because you can maybe potentially do some sort of toolbox type of deck where you put a bunch of Pokemon in the discard pile and then kind of choose what abilities, or I'm sorry, what attacks you want to use while attacking with your Marshadow. And we've seen toolbox decks over the years. One I think that kind of comes to mind that might be a good example of why Marshadow might be decent is the previous Vileplume toolbox that has been on and off popular over the past year or so, where you played Vileplume and then a lot of different wall Pokemon like Regice, Jolteon, Glaceon, Mew EX. But the problem with that type of deck, for example, is that you don't really have a lot of bench space to work with and your board becomes kind of clunky. So in these types of situations, something like Marshadow actually might be better because it frees up a lot of bench space since you just have to discard the Pokemon. So Marshadow has, I think, potential in toolbox style decks. I think also decks that are weak to fighting Pokemon. If you throw a Marshadow in your deck, you can potentially, throw your Marshadow down and have an easy answer to these decks that are fighting weak that might give you a problem. And of course, also in expanded format, we have a ton of tools to work with. In particular, we have Battle Compressor to search out cards from our discard to put them in our discard pile, which means a card like Marshadow could be good in something like Night March, which it's been getting some hype for. So just in general, I think Marshadow looks to be a very versatile card, but unfortunately in the standard format, I don't see too much potential use for Marshadow at the time of filming. In expanded, I think this card is a lot more exciting, but just in standard, I don't think it has many tools to work with to really make use of this ability to great effects. That's why it is on the lower end of this list, but nevertheless, this ability is fantastic and Marshadow has a ton of potential and we expect it to be good at some point. So next up at number 6, we have yet another Pokemon GX, and that's going to be the new Noivern GX. So let's look at this card. It has 200 hit points on a stage 1, which is solid. Free retreat cost, great. Its attack Distort, well, its main attack Distort, I should say, for a Dark and Colorless does 50 damage and your opponent cannot play item cards. Its second attack, Sonic Volume, for a Psychic Dark and Colorless does 120 and your opponent can't play special energy cards on their Pokemon during their next turn. And then its GX attack for a Psychic Dark and Colorless energy, Boom Burst GX, it does 50 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon. So this card will probably look very familiar to fans of the old Giratina EX and Seismitoad EX deck that was popular at some point. And item block just historically has always been super solid, and that's the reason Noivern GX is placing as high as it is. It's mainly going to be for this Distort attack. So with 1 double Dragon Energy, since that is legal for the Worlds format and at the time of filming, you can do 50 damage, or 80 of course if you have a choice band, but then you get to turn off your opponent's item cards, and even though we have been seeing a decline in the amount of item cards in people's decks, in the early turns of the game especially, they still are going to be reliant on items. They need to be able to play their Ultra Balls, to get their Pokemon out to start setting up. They still want to be able to use their Versus Seekers, again if we're talking about the Worlds or expanded formats, to reuse their supporters. They want to be able to play their tool cards, so item lock has just historically been insanely popular. Seismitoad EX in the past had this attack with a lower damage output. Granted, it was on a basic, but nevertheless, this effect is just so strong. But the reason this card is not placing higher on our list is for a few reasons. The first one is going to be, like I said, Double Dragon Energy. It is going to be legal for the Worlds format, but afterwards it is going to be rotated out of standard format, making Noivern's window of play, I guess you could say, pretty small, similar to the Wishful Baton card that we mentioned earlier in this top 10. But the other problem it has is the pesky Fairy weakness, since Gardevoir GX is a very hyped new card that could potentially be difficult for Noivern to deal with. So I think in the short term, Noivern has a couple of problems with it, holding it back from, I guess, like a long-term play. But nevertheless, pretty much all of its attacks are pretty decent. And like I said, item lock has just historically been very good. So Noivern, it has a small window of opportunity to really shine in the game, I think, unless of course they reprint something like a Double Dragon Energy. So if we still had Double Dragon Energy, this card actually might even be higher on the list, but since we are going to lose it, it might be harder to power up Noivern in the future to really make use of this card. But having said that, it's still a very, very strong card and also will have use in the expanded format too. Alright guys, so we are halfway done with the countdown. We have 5 down, and coming in at the number 5 spot, we have Golisopod GX. So yeah, another GX in this top 10. It's a grass Pokemon with 210 hit points, and it's a stage 1 GX, I should mention. So 210 hit points, kind of average, above average. 3 retreat cost and fire weakness are kind of pesky, but I think the attacks on this guy definitely make up for some of those pitfalls that it has. So the main attack we're going to be looking at is going to be First Impression. For just 1 grass energy, you do 30 plus 90 more if Golisopod GX was on your bench and became your active Pokemon this turn. So 120 for 1 is very, very solid. Its second attack, Armor Press, does 100 damage for a grass and double colorless energy, and during your opponent's next turn, this Pokemon takes 20 less damage from attacks. And then its GX move, Crossing Cut GX, for 150 for a grass and DCE. You do 150 like I said, and switch this Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. So the whole idea with this card is to constantly be able to come from the bench and bring it up to the active spot and do 120 for just 1 energy every turn. So we have things like the Super Scoop Up I just mentioned earlier in the set review, so we can pick up our Golisopods, promoting a fresh one, and since we have Force of Giant Plants still for probably a month now, I'd say, at the time of filming, you can scoop up a Golisopod, then immediately evolve back into it, or if you have maybe like a benched Wimpod on your bench, you can pick up a Golisopod, promote your Wimpod, evolve into the new one, and attach 1 energy to do 120. So this is very good because you can deny prize cards with Golisopod by constantly picking it up, and also just do a solid 120. And of course, if you have a choice band, that means you can do 150. There's other tool cards you could opt to play, but I think most people will probably gravitate towards choice band. But then there's other partners for this. You can still play the new supporter Acerola that lets you pick up your Golisopods. You can play things like Zoroark to switch out of the active spot every turn. You could play something like Decidueye to increase your damage output. Just a number of ways you can play this card, and it looks to be like a very, very popular card once Burning Shadows finally releases and starts to see play. So that's why it's coming in at our number 5 spot. Next up at number 4, we have our first supporter of the list. We have Acerola, or Acerola, however you guys want to pronounce it. But you get to put one of your Pokemon that has any damage counters on it and all cards attached to it back into your hand. So like we were just mentioning a second ago with Golisopod GX, if it gets damaged, you can play something like an Acerola to pick it up and all the cards back to your hand. Similar to Super Scoop Up, like I mentioned earlier, it can help you deny its prize cards. If something is stuck in the active spot, you can pick it up that way. Maybe pick up some Pokemon that have coming into play effects like Tapu Bulu GX, just for example. So Acerola is very similar to the old AZ that we used to have from Phantom Forces, and that was a card that saw a play in just a wide variety of decks. It was a very common one of to see. Granted, we had access to Versus Seeker, and we still will with Acerola for the Worlds format, but afterwards it might be a little bit more difficult to use. But nevertheless, I definitely expect to see Acerola still to see play in a number of decks, like Golisopod we just mentioned. Tapu Bulu GX will get a little bit of a boost from this card, and just in general, like I said, I think there will be a number of decks while this card is released that will want to abuse this, and that's why it is placed so far at the top of this list. Number 3 on this list, we have Darkrai GX. So it's no secret Pokemon loves to print very, very powerful Darkrai cards. It seems to be a thing they just keep doing, and Darkrai GX is definitely no different. So Darkrai GX, 180 hit points on a basic GX, very standard, 2 retreat cost, fighting weakness, psychic resistance, all kind of common themes we expect to see on a Darkrai at this point, I think. But the reason it's placed so far up is for its ability, Restoration. Once during your turn before you attack, if this Pokemon is in your discard pile, you may put it onto your bench, then attach a Dark Energy from your discard to this Pokemon. So if you can get Darkrai in your discard pile pretty quickly and get it out with an energy, you can still actually attach an energy for turn. You can also still max Elixir for turn as well. So you can very easily power up a Darkrai GX and start attacking. And its attack Dark Cleave for 2 Dark Energy and a Colorless does 130, and this attack's damage is not affected by resistance. So along with Tapu Koko GX, this is, I believe, the highest base damage of any attack that we have in the game that doesn't have any sort of discarding effect or any other stipulations in order to use the attack. So just a very, very, very solid 130, which 2-shots pretty much mostly everything in the game. So Darkrai GX is a decent attacker, but it also has another attack called Dead End GX. If your opponent's active Pokemon is affected by a special condition, that Pokemon is now knocked out. So this is also pretty solid, just because if you do inflict your opponent with some sort of special conditions, and there are a number of ways to do that. Currently we have Ariados, we have Salazzle, but more importantly in the expanded format we have Hypnotoxic Laser. We can very easily take an instant knockout with this GX move potentially. So Darkrai, like I just mentioned, I think has a ton of potential in the expanded format, since we also have access to things like Battle Compressor to easily search out our Darkrai's and Dark Energy and put them into our discard pile. So Darkrai, I think, is a decent attacker on its own, but I think the real reason most people are excited for this card is because you can pair this with the Darkrai EX that came out of Breakpoint. So Darkrai EX does more damage based on every Dark Energy it has on the field. So you can, or the idea at least, is to put a bunch of Darkrai GXs in your discard pile early on, and then use Restoration to get them out into play with a Dark Energy, getting you an extra attachment for turn, in addition to the energy that you have on field with your max elixirs and your normal attachments. And it's basically just to boost your Darkrai EX's damage output. But it's also good too, just because if you do want to attack with Darkrai GX and it gets knocked out, well, guess what? You can immediately get it back into play with its Restoration ability. So this is definitely a card I expect to see do very well in both the standard and expanded formats, and that's why it is placing so high on this list. Coming in at the number 2 spot, we have Guzma, another supporter from Burning Shadows. Switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active Pokemon. If you do, switch your active Pokemon with one of your bench Pokemon. So if you guys aren't familiar with Lysander or haven't been playing over the past couple of years, Lysander has been a very, very dominant card and has been in at least a 2 of in almost every deck since it's been released. Just because being able to take knockouts on whatever Pokemon you want is just so good, especially if, let's say, you have 4 prize cards and your opponent is going to try to promote a non-EX or non-GX in order to force you to take 1 prize. Well, guess what? You could play something like a Guzma or a Lysander to bring up maybe a GX or EX to take your last 2 prizes and get a knockout. Also, if you're behind early on in the game and you need to stall, you can sometimes Guzma up or Lysander up, since we still have that in the format. Maybe one of your opponent's bench Pokemon to try to stall for a little bit. So this switching effect is so good. It's definitely not to be underrated if you guys are new to the game. But yeah, this switching effect is incredibly powerful. And also the additional switching effect that Guzma has over Lysander is actually pretty good in a lot of situations. So for example, at the time of filming in the Guardians Rising format, we have Espeon GX as a very popular attacker, and it has an attack that confuses you. Well, that's kind of a pain, because then on your turn you'll have to flip to attack. So if you play something like a Guzma, you can just get out of that effect without having to manually retreat. So that's a way you can get around status conditions. Also, if your opponent is trying to Lysander stall you or Guzma stall you, especially after rotation, when we won't have Lysander anymore, you can play something like a Guzma to get out of the active spot and promote a Pokemon that you actually want to attack with. And another thing I think that's really underrated about this card is how it actually frees up deck space for you. So some decks, their Pokemon might be kind of heavy and have big retreat costs, so they might play something like Olympia in their list. So take something like Vileplume variants. That's a common card that we see pop up once in a while, just because Vileplume has a big retreat cost. And again, other decks play this as well. But if we have Guzma in format, we can just change our Lysanders over to Guzma if we want, and that way we can actually cut maybe one or two switching cards out of our deck to free up space for other things, to maybe make our deck run a little bit more smoothly or faster, or maybe have a couple spots for some tech cards to put in your list. So just in general, this is just such a very good card, and like I said, there's even situations where this is even better than Lysander, so that's why it is going to be up so high on the list. And especially with Lysander leaving the format, this is going to be our primary way of, choosing what we want to take knockouts on, and this is just going to be a very, very important card after rotation as well. So that's why Guzma did climb all the way up to the top to take our number 2 spot. So coming in at the number 1 spot should not surprise anyone who has been keeping up with Burning Shadows, and that's going to be Gardevoir GX. Similar to Darkrai, Pokemon just loves printing powerful Gardevoir cards. They've been doing so a lot over the years, and Gardevoir GX, like Darkrai GX, is no exception to this. So Gardevoir GX, 230 hit points, slightly below average on a stage 2, but it has a lot going for it. So its ability, Secret Spring, once during your turn before you attack, you may attach a Fairy Energy card from your hand to one of your Pokemon. Its attack, Infinite Force, for a single Fairy Energy does 30 times the number of energy attached to both active Pokemon, and then its GX move, Twilight GX, for a Fairy Energy, shuffle 10 cards from your discard pile back into your deck. Everything about this card is just very, very good. So let's look at the attack, Infinite Force. Mewtwo EX and Lugia EX of the past had a very similar ability, and even Yveltal EX had a very similar attack as well. But those cards only did 20 times the amount of energy and saw immense play. Mewtwo EX in particular was one of the most dominant cards for so long after it came out. And again, that was only 20 times the amount of damage, but this one's 30. So that's already an improvement in itself. And then Gardevoir GX can also power up itself. So once during your turn, like I said, you can attach a Fairy Energy from your hand to this Pokemon. So you can use Secret Spring, put a Fairy Energy down, attach a double Colorless from hand, and that's 90 damage just from your side alone. That's not counting any energy that your opponent might have. And once you get multiple Gardevoir GX in play, you can attach multiple additional Fairy Energies every turn. And if your opponent does not have a way to knock out Gardevoir GX in one hit, then they're going to have a tough time, because if they give you enough time to just load a bunch of energy onto a Gardevoir GX, you can kind of just roll over your opponent, if they don't have a way to stop you. And then its GX move, while not the star of the show, is actually very important, because at the time of filming in the Guardians Rising format, Garbodor variants have been extremely popular, with Drampa Garbodor and Espeon Garbodor being very, very popular decks that do damage based on the amount of item cards that you have in your discard pile. So Gardevoir can actually deal with these decks very easily, because once you've put a bunch of items in your discard pile, you can take a turn to use Twilight GX and shuffle them back into your deck. But just even outside of Garbodor, this is very good, because we can get back things like rare candies, we can get back energy maybe we've had to discard, evolution pieces, etc. So this is just an insane recovery attack, and just another great thing that this card has going for it. And at the time of filming, this is expected to be probably the most dominant deck to come out of Burning Shadows. It's already been performing very well in Japan since it won their nationals level event that they had recently, and it looks to be very strong in our format as well. So that's why Gardevoir is going to be taking the top spot. I think everyone kind of saw this one coming. It's definitely been the most hyped card out of the set, and for very good reason. So yeah guys, that is going to be our top 10 Burning Shadows cards with these types of videos. We love to hear your feedback. Did we miss any cards, or are there any that you think we should have ranked higher or lower on this list? Definitely let us know below in the comments, and let us know your opinion. But yeah guys, that's going to be pretty much it for this one. As usual, feel free to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out our merchandise over at rarecandytcg.com. If you can pick up something to help support our channel, it'd mean a lot to us. But with that, I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you for the next one.